Okay, joining me now is Dr. Laura Catena. Laura, thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to be on the podcast with me today.
Thank you very much. Grazie mille, Fritz.
Yeah, so when we were chatting before recording, we both discovered that we both speak Italian and we chatted there. And thank you for the compliments that my grammar is okay. I'll be sure to
Yes,
spread
it's
that to my,
excellent.
thank you so much. But we're going to do this in English today. But you can pepper in some Spanish too if you want.
Okay.
Um, but I know we're going to be focused on your work and research that you and your team have been doing on old vines in Argentina's ungrafted Massale vineyards. But you and your family have such an amazing legacy and stories. So could you share a little bit about that with us before we jump into our topic?
Yes, well, it starts in the 1800s with the Italian side of winemaking from Le Marche. My great, 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 great grandfather and great, great grandfather. Uh, the last one was Vincenzo Catena, and they have a son and a grandson who is interested in making wine. But he was the youngest child of the Italian family, so he knew he wasn't going to get anything, and he didn't want to go into the military, become a priest. So he decides to come to Argentina with the specific mission to make wine in Mendoza, which was known as the best region to make wine in Argentina. And he comes at the age of 18. And in 1902, a few years later, 4 years later, he plants his first vineyard and literally has to work for 4 years to make enough money, and then starts making wine in 1902, Malbec and Bonarda.
Can you just start by describing what Massal selection is all about? And then
Yeah,
we can get into ungrafted and old
yeah,
vine and the other stuff.
yeah, absolutely. So I have been talking about this for at least 25 years, but no one was listening until recently, because now the Europeans have started talking about this. And a lot of very famous properties, even Saskia Rocha from Chateau Lafite, and, the Gaia family, Angelo and Gaia, who are really good friends, they are finding Massal selections of, Nebbiolo in Italy, of Cabernet Sauvignon, and replanting their vineyards with that. Massal being different from clone. But I'm going to explain it further in a minute.
Right.
But I have literally been talking about this from Argentina because about 90% of our vineyards are Massal, not clonal. And no one understood what I was talking about except for one person who understood it and told me that that was what I needed to spend my time doing. And this conversation was at the Naples wine auction. I believe it was in 2005. So the gentleman's name, most of you will know, is Aubert de Vilaine. So
Okay.
the famous proprietor of Romanée Conti. And I was at the Naples wine auction, and I remember that I was wearing this really tight dress and I was very uncomfortable. And so I see Aubert de Vilaine, who I of course recognize, with his American wife, walking down this little hill area. And I say, do I go talk to him about my Pinot Noir? Because we had planted the Dijon clones at high altitude to see what we could do with Pinot Noir in Argentina, because my father and I love Pinot Noir. And we wanted to see, could we do a cool climate Pinot Noir, just like we have done some great cool climate Chardonnay. And this was, in the early 1990s, we planted those Dijon clones. So I go to Aubert de Vilaine and I'm thinking, oh, do I have the audacity to tell him that I planted Pinot Noir in Argentina? And he's very gracious. And I start a conversation and I say, oh, I have Pinot Noir. I make a Pinot Noir. Back then it was Luca. Now I have also a brand called Domenico from Single Parcels. And he says, okay, that's wonderful. So what do you have planted? And I said, oh, I have the Dijon clones. And I start, reciting 777, 115. And he looks at me with this kind of, he's trying to figure out whether to be nice or not.
Oh
And
no.
and he's like, oh, that's terrible. He says, the only good Pinot Noir comes from Massale selections. And I look at him and I was like, oh, Massale selections? Well, that's most of what we have in Argentina, because all our Malbec is Massale. Like back then, there were no clones at all. Like now there's a few clones that have come from Côte from France for high yield, for lower quality vineyards. And we have developed some clones, Catena, just to study the different, quality clones. And we have, we plant a small percentage of clones. But back then, pretty much everything was Massale. And when I tell him about this, he says, well, you should probably stop focusing any of your attention away from Pinot Noir and only focus your attention on Malbec. And even after that, 2005, that was a long time ago, 20 years ago, I have been talking about this and nobody paid attention. And it took the Europeans to start talking about it for people to be interested. So now, what is a Massale selection? You want me to?
Yes.
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 Okay.
All the buildup.
Okay. So Massale selection is the way vineyards were planted for thousands of years. We've been drinking wine for probably about 6,000 years. And until the 1950s, most vineyards in the world were planted by Massale selection. What that means is that you basically go to your neighbor's vineyard, to your own vineyard, and you take the cuttings from a certain sector of that vineyard and you plant them in another sector. And generally, those cuttings were genetically diverse. So people didn't have a vine nursery that provided a clone until recently. So when Malbec came to Argentina in 1855, it didn't come in, the Dijon clones. It came in a genetically diverse selection. It would be like a whole village came. And there was
Right.
one individual or a couple of individuals of each. And so you brought a whole village as opposed to just bringing Fritz, which would be a clone. If
Right.
you planted only Fritz, that's a clone. If you plant a whole village, that's a Massale selection.
For the
Yeah.
listener who's a grape grower or who does their own propagation, is how different is this? The grower might think, well, wait a minute, can I create my own Massale
Mhm.
vineyard if I just go to a nursery here in the, wherever I buy my vines, and they have 20 different clones of Cabernet Sauvignon? Can I just buy
Yeah.
20 different clones, all grafted on the same rootstock, and plant them in the vineyard randomly, or even in a
Yeah.
more organized way? Can I create a
Yeah.
Massale vineyard? I think it would have to be
Yeah.
random. They'd have to
Yeah.
disperse them and almost shuffle the deck a little and then plant
Yeah.
them. Is that a
Yeah.
Massale vineyard, or is
Yeah.
that not?
So I just want to add one thing about these old vineyards is that older vineyards will have more genetic diversity because they've had fewer selection points. So that's why we are taking cuttings from really old vineyards and saving those. But now back to your answer, to your question. First of all, I think FPS is phenomenal. That is a luxury. We actually have had somebody from FPS, Maher, come to Argentina and talk to us. He was in Chile doing something. We invited him to Argentina. He talked to our producers about virus testing, and we have collaborated with the local universities to help do virus testing and provide virus-free material. FPS is a luxury. We don't have an FPS in Argentina. If we had an FPS in Argentina, it'd be amazing because virus problems are severe. And so I think that is so amazing that the US has spent the money and invested in FPS existing. And even if it's expensive, what they do, it's so worth it because, if you plant a vineyard with virus, especially if you have the virus in both the rootstock and in the cutting, like there's a high probability you're going to have like a lot of problems, and then it spreads to the other vineyards if there's a vector. So FPS is amazing. But back to your question about, can you recreate a Massale selection? So I think you can recreate the concept of the Massale. Like Massale implies that you're going to a vineyard that's already genetic diverse and taking cuttings from there. That's what Massale means. But you could replicate genetic diversity by just doing what you said, taking some cuttings now and planting them. Now, what we find is that it takes several years for the genetically diverse vines to kind of become a family. So at the beginning, you have very different ripening times because there's cuttings, like they can vary within 2 weeks. When we've done research, there is actually good research that you plant some cuttings in other places and they reach, 23, 24 bricks with 2 weeks difference. And that's a big span. But when they're all planted together, by year 5, that 2 weeks could become 2 days. So you actually have pretty even ripening, but you'll have some yielding higher and some yielding lower. So yes, in answer to your question, you could recreate a genetically diverse selection. I think you'd have to be really careful to not do, for example, a very high yielding clone and a very low yielding clone.
Right.
Um, because then you might have like very different ripening times. But a little difference in the ripening times is good because you'd have slightly greener fruit and slightly riper, and that could increase complexity. And that's what we see in our Massales. So I think it'd be really cool if somebody did that in the US or anywhere.